everybody to this webinar shiur titled Part of the Miracle, Women and Megillah. We are in for a real treat as I introduce our speaker, Rabbanit Sara Tillinger Wolkenfeld, who is the Director of Education at Sefaria, a new online database and interface for Jewish texts. She is passionate about Talmud education and expanding Jewish ritual knowledge for all. Her previous experience includes serving as Director of Education at the Center for Jewish Life, Hillel at Princeton University, as well as the OU's Jewish Learning Initiative on campus. She studied Talmud and Jewish law at various institutions of Jewish learning in Israel and America, including Midreshet Lindenbaum, Drisha, Nishmat, and Beit Morasha, and speaks on various Jewish topics at synagogues, schools, and university communities. She lives in Chicago with her husband and their 5 children. And I just want to say on a personal note how grateful I am for all of your good work. I have come to rely so heavily on Sefaria as a resource and a tool to improve my own research and study. So thank you for that. For everybody who's on, welcome. Please take notes and feel free to ask questions at the end. You can either share them if you're logged in via Zoom in the chat box or comment on Facebook. And now I'm going to give it to Rabbanit Tillinger Wolkenfeld.
Hi, thank you so much. Chodesh Tov, I'm really excited to learn with you all today. And I'm so grateful to JOFA, both for the opportunity to give this webinar and also for the opportunity to have written the chapter in the book. To begin with, it's really an amazing project to be a part of. If you don't own the book yet, you should. Hilchot Nashim, Volume 1. It's an amazing project to be a part of. And again, I'm so grateful. There are 2 reasons that I really love talking about the topic of women and Kriyat Megillah, women and the reading of the Book of Esther. One is that reading Esther is something that I've been involved with for many, many years now. It's been a part of my religious life really since I was a child, and a very important piece of my spiritual life. And the other thing that's so interesting about learning this topic is that we really see the possibilities of women fulfilling this mitzvah for one another, on behalf of one another, from the time, beginning from the early sources. And that's not always the case with these kinds of topics. So it makes for a really interesting halachic journey through these sources. So let's get started. There are a number of questions I'd like to touch on, and as was mentioned before, please feel free to put more questions in the chat, in the Zoom, in the Facebook comments, whatever you'd like. But to get us started, I want to talk about what's the nature of women's obligation in Kriyat Megillah. What's the nature of women's obligation in Megillah reading? May a woman read Megillah for other women? May a woman read Megillah for men? And once we've established that, once we've figured out the chiyuv, the nature of the obligation, and who a woman can read for, I want to make sure that we touch on the blessings that a woman recites when she reads Megillah or participates in a woman's reading, as well as the question of whether women constitute a quorum for the purpose of Megillah reading. That's really tied into the question around the blessings. So I'm going to make sure to leave some time for that at the end. I know we already got 1 or 2 questions about that, so I'm going to make sure to do that at the end. But to really understand this discussion, the early sources are actually the most important. So I'm going to spend the first chunk of our time delving into those early sources so that you get a sense of where this whole conversation is coming from. We're going to start with the Mishnah in Masechet Megillah, a Mishnah that seems really, as Mishnayot go, extremely, extremely straightforward. The Mishnah says that everyone is fit to read Megillah. It uses the word hakol, everyone. And the question, whenever a source uses the word hakol, whenever a Mishnah especially uses the word hakol, is, does it really mean everybody? Is it everybody, or is it just some of everybody? Because you could imagine a conversation that starts with the word everybody, and then it turns out that, well, we didn't really mean everybody. We meant everybody who was relevant to the conversation. So in this case, it's a good question. It's still good to sort of check on that front. Do we really mean everybody? But the Mishnah is actually quite clear about who we mean and who we don't mean, or at least seemingly quite clear about who we mean and who we don't. So the Mishnah says that this hakol really includes everybody. Hakol chayavim likrot et Megillah. Everyone is obligated to read Megillah. Except for a few people. I'm going to call them the triumvirate of compromised da'at. That's how I think about them in rabbinic literature. These are three types of people who maybe don't have the ability to kind of fully mentally invest in a project. Someone who is deaf-mute, someone who is mentally incapacitated, and a minor. And so those three are excluded, which presumably means that when we say that everyone is obligated to read the Megillah, or everyone, is kasher to read the Megillah, everyone is fit to read the Megillah, we mean, okay, except for those people, but everyone else should be included. And the Mishnah goes on to say that actually Rabbi Yehuda would allow a katan to read, but we'll leave that aside for now. The discussion in the Gemara here around this Mishnah really centers on the question of the katan, of the minor. But for our purposes today, we want to talk about women. And so elsewhere in the Gemara and Megillah, elsewhere in Masechet Megillah, there's a very famous statement. Amar Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi said, Nashim chayavot b'mikra Megillah, sha'af hen hayu ba'oto hanes. Women are obligated in the reading of Megillah because they too were included in that miracle. Now, two things to note here. One is that this phrase, af hen hayu ba'oto hanes, they too were included in that miracle. It's a little bit ambiguous, and it's debated in the Rishonim, it's debated in the early interpretations what exactly that means. One possibility is that this is just saying that women were in danger when the story of Purim happens. All the Jews are in danger of being wiped out. Women too were in danger. Women as well were saved, and therefore this obligation is something that should be incumbent on both men and women. The other possible, a little more tenuous interpretation, though a little bit more exciting interpretation maybe, is that women were personally involved in the salvation of the Jewish people at this time. And therefore, af hen hayu ba'oto hanes means that we're celebrating that, and so they too must be obligated. Either way, Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi is certainly saying they're obligated in Mikra Megillah. Now, the other thing to note about this source, which I won't go into now, but just to think about, this is often read in opposition to the sort of famous, generally known rule, I'll put rule in air quotes, that women are exempt from positive time-bound mitzvot. And what I would say, again in brief, because this is not our subject right now, is that rule is not borne out even more often than it is borne out. It's not a great predictive rule. And it's not clear that Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi is really speaking in opposition to that rule. He's just stating a fact, but okay. So the Mishnah says everyone's kosher to read Megillah except for a few people, but women are included in the everybody. The Gemara in Megillah says, Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi says that women are obligated in the reading of Megillah, as they too were included in that miracle. And one more Talmudic source that we need here, or one more source from the Bavli, is in the Gemara in Erechim, Hakol chayavin b'mikra Megillah, Hakol kshirin likrotas haMegillah. Putting our Mishnah in conversation with another Tannaitic source, everyone is kosher to read the Megillah, and everyone is obligated to read the Megillah. And then the Gemara asks, to include, who does this come specifically to include? Why use the word hakol? And the answer is la'tuye nashim, to include women, as per Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi's statement that women too were included, and therefore women are obligated in the reading of Megillah. It's a very straightforward piece of Gemara, seems to confirm what we already think we know from the Mishnah and from the other piece of the Gemara. One more Talmudic source that I'll throw in here, not from the Bavli, but from the Yerushalmi. The Yerushalmi corroborates the statement of Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, but it's a little more ambiguous there. The story there is that Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi said that Megillah had to be read to women. The book of Esther had to be read to women because they too were in danger. He doesn't use the word there, af hen hayu ba'oto hanes. They too were included in the safek. So clear in that case that what Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi is referring to is the fact that women were also in danger. And the story that gets told in the Yerushalmi is that Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, because he believed this, every year he would take out the Megillah and he would read it to the women and all the people of his household. So same story, but slightly different emphasis. It's not clear whether this means that he thought that was the way it had to be. Was he holding up a paradigmatic behavior? Women have to be part of Megillah and therefore a man has to read for the women. Or maybe this was just the reality at the time. This was just his practice. This was what he did. He read Megillah. Maybe there wasn't a woman in his household who could read Megillah. Not clear from the Yerushalmi. Certainly his statement in the Bavli is clear that there's an actual obligation for women in Mikra Megillah, in the reading of the Megillah. Now we'll go to the source that's an outlier. Everything in the Bavli is consistent. The Yerushalmi is maybe a little ambiguous, but basically consistent. But the other really important source to know about here is the Tosefta. The Tosefta, if you're not familiar with it, is a collection of Tannaitic material. It comes from this roughly the same time period as the Mishnah, but these are sources that were not included in our Mishnayot. They're not included in our collection of Mishnah. Sometimes, I would say even often, the Gemara will quote from the Tosefta. The Gemara can quote what's called a Breita, it can quote another piece of Tannaitic material, and sometimes that Tannaitic material comes from the Tosefta. In this case, the Gemara does not quote this Tosefta, so it doesn't appear in our Talmud, it just appears in the collection called the Tosefta. And the Tosefta starts off very similar to the Mishnah. It says, Hakol Chayavin, everybody is obligated in the reading of the Megillah, and it lists all different kinds of men, Kohanim, Leviim, etc. And more kinds of men, and everyone who's obligated can fulfill the obligation on behalf of others. And this is an important point that a little bit maybe the earlier sources assumed, and maybe it's obvious, but worth stating at least briefly. In general, we assume that if you're obligated in a mitzvah, that you can fulfill that obligation on behalf of others. And it works the other way too. If you're not obligated, then you can't fulfill the mitzvah on behalf of others. So the Tosefta just really makes it clear, Kulan chayavin umotzi'in et harabim yedei chavatan. Everybody here is obligated and can fulfill the obligation on behalf of others. But then at the end, he says, Nashim va'avadim, or they say, the Tosefta says, Nashim va'avadim v'ktanim p'turin ve'ein motzi'in et harabim yedei chavatan. Women, slaves, and minors are exempt and cannot fulfill the obligation on behalf of the masses, can't fulfill the obligation on behalf of others. This is a different triumvirate than we had excluded in the Mishnah. The Mishnah, like I said, excludes a triumvirate of da'at, of people who can't fully mentally invest in the project. And this is a different grouping, although a frequent one in rabbinic literature. Nashim va'avadim v'ktanim will say people who are considered in whatever case kind of marginal to the tzibur, kind of marginal to the community, marginal to society in whatever way. They're not included in the chiyuv. That's really what it means to group women with those other two groups. And so they're not included in this chiyuv, and they don't fulfill the obligation on behalf of others. Now, it's not so unusual to have a Tosefta that disagrees with our Mishnah or disagrees with our Gemara. Often in that case, it'll get quoted by the Gemara in opposition. Here, it doesn't get quoted, so it's really not even clear that this Tosefta would make it into our mainstream halachic process. There's no effort by the Talmud to bring it into the conversation. And I guess, as a spoiler alert, I'll tell you, but if it didn't get included in the later halachic discussion, I wouldn't be teaching it to you right now. So this source does become important. And we see this in the Geonic sources. So moving from the Talmud to the time period of the Geonim, basically the next major time period following the Talmud, following the redaction of the Talmud, the Bahag quotes the Tosefta. And this is really what moves the Tosefta into kind of the prime time of our halachic discussion. Because as I said, there was a chance that it might not be that important. But Bahag, the Baal Halachot Gdolot, an important Geonic source, quotes the Tosefta. And he seems to be trying to kind of reconcile the Tosefta with the Mishnah and the Gemara, which is, I would say at first glance, impossible. Like they're opposites. The Mishnah and the Gemara are saying that women are obligated. We assume that means they can fulfill the obligation on behalf of others. They're obligated in Mikra Megillah. And the Tosefta is saying they're not obligated and they can't fulfill the obligation. So for whatever reason, Bahag decides to try to reconcile these two pieces, which again seems initially maybe a little bit impossible. And what the Bahag says is that maybe there are, not maybe, he thinks that there are two different obligations. There are really just two different obligations here. One is reading Megillah, and the other is hearing Megillah. So, Nashim va'avadim v'ktanim p'turin mikriyat Megillah. First, he goes through all the men who are obligated, like the Tosefta, but women and slaves and minors are patur, they're exempt from the reading of Megillah. Ve'ein motzi'in rabim yedei chavatan, and again, they can't do it on behalf of others. Ela shechayavin b'mashma, but they have to hear Megillah. Lama, why is this the case? shehakol hayu b'safek lahashmid v'laharog u'la'abed. Because everyone was in danger. So picking up on Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi's point in the Yerushalmi, and echoing the language, maybe this is familiar if some of you are actually practicing right now for your own Megillah readings, this language appears in the Megillah itself, that they were in danger of being destroyed and wiped out and all sorts of terrible things. So because they experienced that national trauma, they also have to hear the Megillah read, but they're not obligated in reading the Megillah. And so you can then say, well, whenever the Gemara refers to being obligated, when the Mishnah says hakol ksherin and hakol chayavin and the Gemara, all of that, that's all a reference to hearing the Megillah. And Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi's statements, that's a reference to hearing the Megillah. But reading the Megillah, that's something that only men are obligated in. Now, it's possible to say a lot of things about Bahag here, and I'm not going to go into it in depth. It's a fascinating source because, again, what did he think he was doing? Was he actively trying to reconcile these two sources? Why go with the Tosefta? And there's also a possibility that Bahag actually had a different girsa of the Gemara. It's possible that he actually thought that Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi said, Nashim chayavot lishmoa mikra Megillah, that women are obligated to hear the Megillah, which would, of course, change everything and make it not as much of a reconciliation process or a different kind of reconciliation process. It's really unclear. But this is what Bahag says, and this becomes a major, major factor in halachic decision-making going forward, because all of a sudden we've taken the Tosefta, which was kind of on the sidelines, and brought it in to our halachic discussion. One more source from the time period of the Geonim, which will really round out your sense of where everything that comes afterwards is headed. Tshuvot HaGeonim, another Geonic source, says, he's actually talking about Birkat HaMazon, that's really the context, is the grace after meals, and says that women are obligated in Megillah, but she shouldn't fulfill the obligation on behalf of other people. And so too, by the way, with Birkat HaMazon, says it about both of these things. And it's not exactly clear why, but were she to do this, were she to do one of these things on behalf of her husband, tavo alav me'ara, a curse should come upon him. Isha mechuyavet b'mikra Megillah, aval lo totzi et harabim kach b'Birkat HaMazon. She is obligated, but she shouldn't exercise this obligation on behalf of men. Seems like there's some kind of shame factor going on, that she could do it, but God forbid that she should have to do it. God forbid that a man should need her to do that on his behalf. Once you have these sources down, the Mishnah, the Bavli, the Yerushalmi, and these two Geonic sources, as I said, you really have a pretty full picture of the entire trajectory of the rest of the conversation. At least until we get to the Achronim. This is the substance of the conversation from here on in. One possibility is that women are equally obligated to men. And again, if women are equally obligated, then there's really no reason to assume on the face of it that they can't fulfill the obligation on behalf of men. On the other hand, maybe they don't have the same obligation. Maybe they have a different obligation. One is kriya and one is mashma. And if they're different obligations, then there's really no reason to assume that a woman could perform this obligation on behalf of men, although it definitely leaves open the possibility that a woman could read for other women, as presumably they would share the same obligation. And then we have this other piece that gets introduced by Tshuvot HaGeonim, that maybe men and women do kind of share an obligation. We're not hung up on the obligation piece, but even though they share an obligation, there would be something really negative about a woman fulfilling that obligation on behalf of a man. And again, I think that leaves open the possibility. I have no reason to assume that doesn't leave open the possibility of a woman reading for other women, but she wouldn't be able to read on behalf of a man. And in fact, halachic decisors really fall into three camps. They really fall into these three buckets. One group says women can read for men. We've read the Mishnah, we've read the Gemara, women can read Megillat Esther for men, not a problem. They're equally obligated. The second group say women could read Megillah for men. You're right, they could. They share the same obligation, but they shouldn't. That would be a bad idea for whatever reason. And the third camp is women really can't read for men because they fundamentally don't share the same obligation. They're obligated to hear Megillah and not to read Megillah. So, for example, you have sources like Rashi on the Talmud, the Or Zarua. Both of these sources are extremely straightforward. Women can read for men. Women can read for men. They share an obligation. The Gemara in Arachin says that they can read. The Tosefta, and by extension the Bahag, reads that as saying that women can read for women, but the Or Zarua points out, like, why would you assume otherwise? Why would you need a source to tell you that women can read for other women? If women are obligated, so of course they are. So the Or Zarua really reads Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi's statement, that original statement about Afhen Hayuba Tohanes, as particularly coming to tell you, don't think that women can't read for men, because obviously they can read for other women, but they can even read for other men. Afhen Hayuba Tohanes. And of course, it helps Rashi and the Or Zarua and that whole camp that the Talmud never mentions a distinction between reading the Megillah and hearing the Megillah. And by the way, there are all sorts of fascinating conversations to have here about, do we ever have those kinds of distinctions in halakha, and when do we, and when is it applicable? But it doesn't come up in the Gemara at all with regard to Mikra Megillah. So lots of important Rishonim in this camp. The Rambam, for example, pretty much just paskins straight from the Gemara. He pretty much just says, yeah, everyone's obligated to read Megillah, everyone's kosher to read Megillah. There is some debate in the Nosei Kilim in the commentaries on the Rambam, but the Magid Mishnah, for example, supports this reading, says, yes, Maimonides thinks that women can read for men. That is a straightforward reading of the Gemara. So I would say that's the first group in a nutshell. The first group of Rishonim, they just read the Gemara, and they say, not that they don't read the other sources, but that's really the source that they privilege, and they say, yes, women can read Megillah on behalf of men, and by extension, also on behalf of other women. Then you have the second group of Rishonim, who pick up right where the Tshuvot HaGeonim left off. They say that, yes, men and women share an obligation to read Megillah. And so, yes, in theory, that means that women can read Megillah on behalf of men. But in practice, that would be terrible. And there are different reasons why it might be terrible. One is this kind of vague tavo alav me'ara idea that it would be sort of shameful. A man should be cursed if he needed his wife to read for him. You have sources that mention the idea of kvod hatzibor, like the Ritva, that it wouldn't be within the honor of the congregation for a woman to read on behalf of men. And maybe most interestingly, because it's such an outlier in this conversation, the Kolbo says that women, again, could read on behalf of men, but shouldn't because of the idea of kol be'isha erva, that a woman's voice is sexually exciting. And so that would rule out the possibility, even though technically speaking, it's fine. So again, just picking up from Tshuvot HaGeonim, that's why I said once you know the early sources, the trajectory of the whole rest of the argument is really pretty clear. And then you have the third group of Rishonim, who privilege the reading of Bahag and don't want to let go of this idea, or feel that they can't let go of this idea. In some cases, you really see the Rishonim saying, listen, like, I know it doesn't make so much sense, but we don't want to ignore Bahag. So they all have this idea that actually men and women have two different types of obligations, that there's an obligation to read and there's an obligation to hear. And again, what's most interesting to me is that even as they quote Bahag and rule out women reading for men, these sources will sometimes explicitly say that women can read for other women. In other words, for them, the idea of women reading for women, of a women's Kriyat Megillah, is not radical. It's the conservative read of those sources, right? They're being strict. They're saying we should be choshesh for Bahag. We should be concerned about the position of Bahag. And so to make sure that we incorporate that position, we'll only let women read for women. But they don't see women reading for women as any kind of innovative practice or something that would break with that. They see it as accommodating all possible positions, even the strictest possible position, which is that, again, that you have two different kinds of obligations, and therefore women really, they really can't fulfill the obligation on behalf of men who they're around, but again, they could fulfill it for other women. That takes you pretty much through the time period of the Rishonim. Like I said, really very much tracking those earlier sources. We'll move to the law codes, which are, I have to say, in this case, not as helpful as you might hope, not as exciting as you might want it to be. I think that the Rishonim are really, really clear in what they think, and that makes for kind of a great conversation about it. The law codes, for example, the Torah and the Shulchan Aruch, are not as clear about what they're actually saying about women and the reading of Megillah, because they both record both positions. They both record the idea that a woman is fully obligated, and they also record the idea that maybe a woman should not read for a man. So the Torah sounds kind of like the Tosefta, but says that women are obligated to read, and then quotes both Rashi and Bahag, which, if you've already done the research, when I was writing this article and I already done the research and read all the Rishonim, and then I read the Torah, it was extremely disappointing and anticlimactic. Like, the Torah just recorded these positions. I read these positions already. I want you to tell me which is it. And the Torah doesn't do that. And then the Shulchan Aruch says that women are obligated to read, and then says that there are those who say, Yesh Omrim, that a woman shouldn't read, shouldn't fulfill the obligation on behalf of a man. It seems like most later authorities think that when the Shulchan Aruch quotes a Yesh Omrim, when he says, here's what I think, but by the way, there are those who say X, that the Shulchan Aruch is actually ruling like the first position, right? The Yesh Omrim is just telling you, listen, you should know, FYI, there are people who say this, but that's not kind of where it's at. But not everyone thinks that. And of course, if he really believes that women can read for men, then why quote the second position at all, right? Why say that at all? So it's unclear, and it's really ambiguous in the law codes, and people debate it back and forth, poskim debate it back and forth. When you get to the Achronim, though, when you get to the later halachic decisors, this is where we see a real shift, a real break. I told you, right, those earlier sources can really guide you through the whole conversation in the Rishonim. It's almost like, not that you don't need to read them, but everything that the Rishonim say is pretty predictable based on the Mishnah, the Talmud, and the Tosefta, and the Geonic sources. Like, those predict that entire conversation. When you get to the Achronim, though, there's a break. The Achronim, there are still three groups, I would say, three main buckets that you can put the positions into, but they're different. One is the group of people, small group of poskim, of halachic decisors, who say that women can read for men. Again, it's pretty much the straightforward reading of the Gemara. The Aruch HaShulchan says this after much explanation and back and forth, says that women can read for men. The Midreshet, which I'm not going to go into here, but you should definitely read this one because it's super fun, I think. The Midreshet says, after a lot of other things that he says, that women can read for men at night, but not during the day. Interesting distinction. And that's pretty much it. And then you have a group, again, predictably, that say that men and women have different obligations, and so women cannot read for men. So those Achronim are, they're following the position of Bahag, but what's interesting here is that they seem to be less interested in that line of psak, and more interested in most cases in explaining the position of Bahag. Like, how could you get to this idea that there are actually two different obligations? I mentioned this earlier, right? It's kind of a weird idea. One obligation to read Megillah, one obligation to hear Megillah. It's like not so straightforward how that happened. And so these Achronim, these later sources, spend a lot of time trying to explain like what Bahag was getting at. So just one kind of fun example, the Chavot Yair says that men's obligation in Megillah reading is what he calls ke'ein de'oraita. It sort of derives from a Torah level obligation because we have a mitzvah of lo tasor, of not deviating from that which the rabbis tell us. So there's a kind of quasi Torah obligation for men to read Megillah. But women don't have that Torah level obligation because the reason for their obligation is, as Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi said, Avhen hayu be'oto hanes. And so that's only rabbinic. And so you wind up with this like shift in levels, and women have a different level of obligation than men do. So that's just one explanation. Again, I think these sources are kind of fun, but they don't move the needle on the halachic discussion too much. They're basically just giving different justifications for why men and women have different obligations, and therefore women can't read for men. The third group of Achronim, the third group of these later decisors, is the unprecedented group. This is a group of important poskim, important halachic decisors who say, actually, women cannot read Megillah. Full stop. Women can't read Megillah for other women. Women can't read Megillah for men for sure. Women should hear Megillah read by a man. The reasoning is complicated. It's unclear. In both of the main cases here, the two main sources that I explore and that people quote about this, the Korban Netanel and the Magen Avraham, both rely on earlier sources to formulate this psak, and in both cases, the earlier source that they rely on, it seems both unclear and maybe erroneous. In other words, they didn't have quite the right text of the source, and that's part of what leads them to this conclusion. So for example, the Magen Avraham was really an adventure to research. The Magen Avraham quotes a source called Midreshet Lindenbaum, which is part of the Zohar. Interesting anyway, always fun to investigate when non-Kabbalistic sources decide that they're going to use the Zohar as a basis for psak. So that's kind of fun. Midreshet Lindenbaum doesn't actually exactly say what Magen Avraham says it says, but he quotes Midreshet Lindenbaum as saying that women should hear Megillah from men. We don't usually make halachic rulings, or we often don't make halachic rulings based on the Zohar, especially not when it explicitly contradicts the Talmud. It's one thing to use the Zohar as a support, but this is actually in direct opposition to something that the Gemara says. What can I say? Magen Avraham goes with it, but this is really a new trend in the Achronim, the idea that women can't even read for other women. As I said, it was seen as a pretty small c conservative position in the Rishonim, a pretty straightforward reading of the source. Maybe you wonder whether or not women can read for men, but for sure women can read for other women and no issue. That summarizes the Achronim, and then we move to contemporary sources. So here also you have three groups, pretty much an echo. Maybe one or two who say that a woman can read for a man. It's definitely the minority, but it's definitely there. So for example, Rav Tzvi Pesach Frank allows a woman to read for a man at night. Rav Ovadia Yosef seems very, very comfortable with women reading for men. Night, day, doesn't matter, although his son and some of his students kind of walk that back later on and say maybe not all the time, maybe not really, maybe it's not a good idea, but his tshuvot really do seem to say that a woman could read for a man. Then you have this group of people who say, well, no, actually women can't have Megillah readings at all. A separate woman's Megillah reading would be problematic. They can't read for other women. Probably paradigmatic of this group is Tzilach Bikvei Hatzon, a tshuva by Rav Hershel Schachter at YU. And he says a number of things. First of all, he says that it's not a great way to fulfill the mitzvah because you need a tzibor, you need a congregation. We'll talk about that in a minute. He says it's a change of minhag and that changing customs is bad. I find that argument really interesting because I guess we don't have it attested that women did have Megillah readings, but on the other hand, it's so clear that it's a live option for the Rishonim. Like no one ever got up and said, but it would be crazy to do that, right? I've read like a lot of Rishonim on this and no one ever said that. So I find that piece really interesting. And then also just that it's more broadly problematic, that women wanting to take this kind of initiative is bad. It comes from outside influences. And so less about Kriyat HaMegillah itself, but it's just really a bad idea and you shouldn't do it. And that idea, I think, becomes really widespread in that community. Then you have a third group of poskim, I think certainly also a very dominant voice in the modern Orthodox community, coming largely from originally from poskim in Israel, from halachic decisors in Israel, who say that a woman reading for another woman is totally fine. Women's readings are fine. Again, because they're attested in the Rishonim, because we have so much documentation about them. So some really strong voices of poskim and community leaders. Rav Henkin, for example, who is, thank God, alive in Israel now, says that women reading for women is a totally acceptable option, maybe even sometimes the best option, because it's not always so easy for women to get to a Megillah reading, or I will say it differently actually. It's not always so easy for men and women together to be at the same Megillah reading if there are children involved or other life distractions involved. And it might actually be better sometimes for men and women to be at separate Megillah readings. And so this can be a great option. And I'll also mention Rav Benny Lau, who really wrote very forcefully about the It's really the opposite of what Rav Schechter says in a lot of ways. He says that women's frustration with passivity can actually be a catalyst for religious fervor, for passion in religious life. And so why not pick up on this option that's so clearly present in our early sources and have a women's Kriyat HaMegillah? So that becomes a fairly widespread practice, I think, in the modern Orthodox community, that women would have a women's reading. And really the written statements of Rav Lau, the written pieces of Rav Henkin's Shuvot that we have, they don't spend a lot of time on women reading for men. Like that's not really on the table for them. But women reading for women is an option that they defend and even champion, even try to kind of push. So then there are just two issues that are left for us. If we say that women can have a Kriyat HaMegillah for other women, or even if we want to entertain the possibility of women reading for a mixed reading, what's the status of women vis-a-vis a tzibor, vis-a-vis a quorum for Megillah reading? That was one of Rav Schechter's objections, remember, is that you need a quorum for Megillah reading, and maybe you don't have one if you have a women's reading. And plus, right, if you go all the way back to Yeshua ben Levi, Afen hayu ba'oto hanes, this reminds us that the whole point of reading Megillah is Pirsumei Nisa, is to publicize the miracle. So a little hard to publicize the miracle if it's just you and me in my dining room. So what's the status with regard to tzibor? And parenthetically, I think that this could be a whole article in and of itself. It's a really fascinating question when women are considered tzibor, minyan, quorum, like all these words that get thrown around. I think that's a really interesting question. But briefly here, I'll say that it seems like sometimes, at least, you do need a quorum. You do need 10 for Mikra Megillah. The Gemara in Megillah has a debate between Rav and Rav Asi that either you do or you don't need a quorum for Megillah reading. It's not clear who wins. They both would agree that if you are reading Megillah not on actually the day of Purim, and I'll talk later about that case, that you would need a minyan. But if you're reading it on Purim, there's a debate. It's not clear whether you actually need, the way they frame it there is asara, whether you need 10. They don't say 10 of what, whether you need 10 for that reading. And so predictably, the authorities are split on this, and they kind of go back and forth. The Shulchan Aruch says you should try to get 10, but it's permissible without. The Ramah there adds, well, but it's like unclear if women count towards that 10. And there are Rishonim and Achronim on both sides of the issue. But the initial conversation that happens, and even when the Ramah comments on the Shulchan Aruch, it seems like we're talking about a mixed gender quorum. So the conversation that ensues is something like, maybe it's fine, maybe women count, but maybe there's a problem of having a mixed quorum. There's a concern about priesthood, about licentiousness. And that's really where that conversation goes in the early sources, that if women can't be mitzaref, if women can't be counted, it's because then you would have this mixed gender quorum, and there's a concern about priesthood. And then some people say, no, it's not priesthood, it's just women don't count for minyan, full stop. But you have both of those voices. But what about an all-women's group of 10? Can that be a tzibor? And again, I think this is an interesting question to test in other cases also. But when it comes to Mikra Megillah, this can get tested when you read Megillah early. So this is not a case, if you live like me in America, this isn't something that comes up a lot in our lives, but if you live in Jerusalem, where it's a walled city from the time of Yoshua ben Nun, and Megillah reading is supposed to happen on what we call Shushan Purim, on the 15th of Adar. If the 15th of Adar falls out on Shabbat, then you push Megillah reading a day early. It's called Purim Mishulash. It's very fun. It's like a 3-day holiday. And you push Megillah reading a day early. And then both Rav and Rav Asi in the Gemara would agree that you do need a quorum. So what happens there? By and large, the Israeli authorities are clear that women would count towards a tzibor. If you have 10 women, the Tzitz Eliezer, Rav Waldenberg says clearly, he was a posek in Jerusalem, that if you have 10 women, it's not a problem, because you've removed the priesthood concern. There's no licentiousness issue. It's just women. So even if you thought that was a problem, that's not a problem. And for sure, they count towards this quorum. You can do Pirsumei Nisa with 10. And Rav Henkin actually says, not only that, but even according to Bahag, you would have a quorum because, okay, there are 10 women to listen to the Megillah, if you think that's the obligation, right? But they can for sure form a quorum. And then briefly, just to finish up, and then we'll have a few minutes for questions, the brachot, the blessings that you say for Megillah reading, roughly track to these conversations as well. So there are 4 blessings that are typically recited for Megillah reading. Al Mikra Megillah, the blessing on the mitzvah, a blessing on the miracles, She'asa Nisim Avotenu, Ashehechianu, and which is a non-Purim dependent bracha, and then the bracha at the end of Haravet Rivenu, which really celebrates the salvation that we just read about in the Megillah. Most positions are that if you don't have a quorum, if you don't have asara, then you can't say that last blessing. So whether or not you think you can say that last blessing is going to hinge on whether or not you think this is tzibor. And again, you have a lot of important halachic decisors to rely on to say that women do in fact constitute a halachic quorum. The last question that kind of gets debated is, what about the blessing? If you think that women are obligated to read Megillah, so then the blessing is Al Mikra Megillah, to read the Megillah, same as in any Megillah reading you've ever been to. There is a position that maybe women should make a different blessing if you think they have a different obligation. Mashma Megillah or Lishmoa Megillah, a blessing specifically on the mitzvah that is specific to women in this case, or in this understanding, of hearing the Megillah and not reading the Megillah. So there are sources on both sides of that debate. I think that, so it's interesting, Rav Henkin says Lishmoa is normal, that you should say to hear, but he kind of wonders why that would be the case at the point at which you're actually reading. Rav Avadia Yosef, in keeping with the Sephardic sort of consistency, says that the blessing is likro, is to read, or mikra, to read Megillah. And I think a lot of readings today follow that practice. Rav Lichtenstein was quoted famously as saying that women should say Al Mikra Megillah, on reading Megillah, and so a lot of modern Orthodox readings that happen today follow in that tradition and follow that practice. But there are definitely sources on both sides. So again, if you have a tzibor, if you have 10 women as a tzibor, or if you think that there can be a mixed kriya, then women and men, you say Haravet Rivenu, that's certain. And Al Mikra Megillah versus Mashma Megillah, that, or Likro versus Lishmoa, that would depend on the minhag, on the custom of that community, but I think it really also depends on how you're conceiving of that obligation. It really speaks to how you view, right, going back to that fundamental issue, what is women's obligation? So I'll just end by quoting again this piece from Rav Lau. I think that Mikra Megillah is such an opportunity for women to take an active role. Hopefully you've seen that there's a lot of different ways. There's a lot of different options for what exactly that looks like. But I hope whenever I teach this subject or I write about the subject, I hope that Rav Lau is right, and that the energy around women's Megillah reading is just a portent of things to come, just foreshadows our community overall becoming stronger in our passion for mitzvot. I will stop now and see if there are any questions.
Thank you for that. I appreciate the learning. It's part refresher and part refreshing, and some new learning for me as well. So thank you. Let me go through some of the questions. One of them is on the mitzvah of kriya, of reading. Does it ever count if a woman reads it quietly to herself, putting aside the question of tzibor, but if she's in a place that she can, that she's by herself and doesn't have access to a more public Megillah reading, does it count if she just reads it to herself?
It's sort of a little bit, it depends what you think the chiyuv is, but probably yes. I mean, most would say sure, just that it leaves out, the problem is not having the tzibor, not having the Pirsumei Nisa aspect.
Okay, and if she's reading it to herself, does it have to be out loud, or can she just kind of follow along in the text and read silently to herself?
She should read it so she can hear.
She can, okay. You alluded to Rabbi Frankel's position on whether it's different at night or during the day. Do you want to spend a minute expanding on the difference of the obligations between nighttime reading and the daytime reading?
It's more than a minute conversation. I will just, I'll really refer people there to the article and to the Midreshet specifically, who says that, or I'll say it this way, it's clear that there's an obligation to read Megillah at night and during the day, and it's not so clear that there's a difference in that obligation. The Midreshet says that that there is a difference, and that part of it has to do with obligation, that it's really linked to our chiyuv with regards to Amalek, with regards to remembering Amalek and needing to wipe out Amalek. And men and women have maybe a different chiyuv in that regard, and that could impact their obligation in terms of Megillah.
Okay. Back to the question about Kriya. Does a woman have an obligation to read the Megillah to herself along with the reading?
I think a woman, like everyone else, needs to hear every word. You need to hear every word of the Megillah, and you should have a Megillah in front of you so that if you miss a word, you could read it to yourself.
Okay. In the discussion of Birkat Hamazon, claiming that women shouldn't recite for men on this, and it applies to Megillah, does this discussion of Birkat Hamazon apply if the group is predominantly made up of women and only one man is present?
So, like, sort of whole different area of law. I would say that I'm not sure from the question if the man is joining in the zimun. I think that the idea reflected, in these sources where they're talking about tavo alav me'ara, I think it doesn't matter who's predominant. I think the idea is that if a woman is going to be the one running Birkat Hamazon, that would be problematic for a man.
Okay.
But that's not about chiyuv, right? That's really because these sources are focused on the idea that tavo alav me'ara, that it's like just a terrible, shameful thing.
Okay. I have two questions about kind of your research. The first is, we know that there, as you mentioned, there is ample debate in the text about what women's obligation is and who it's for. Do we know of any actual cases in history of women actually reading Megillah? Do we have any, any, I don't know if it's like recordings, not like audio recordings, but like any history of women reading Megillah either for themselves or for the community?
I don't know of any.
Okay.
Until you get to sort of like the contemporary time period where people talk about that. And I don't know if that's because they didn't exist or because it just wasn't an interest, right? It's sort of interesting, right, that the Rishonim never say, oh, and by the way, my wife did this, but, I feel like it doesn't prove anything one way or the other.
Right. But maybe just the fact that they were having the debate meant that it had to have happened and that the debate was a response to.
Maybe. I mean, a lot of times what you get into with these kinds of issues is an argument from silence, right? That poskim didn't say that it was forbidden. And in this case, it's more than that, right? They explicitly say, yeah, this is totally fine. So that's a difference, but not that we have any attested evidence.
Another question that just popped in. Do we know anything about women's literacy?
I definitely do not, being a leftist and not a historian. I think, the most that we do know is that most men weren't literate, and for sure most women weren't literate. Literacy, reading and also Jewish literacy for men and for women comes much later, and it comes for women a little bit later than it does for men. But at the time, certainly at the time of the Rishonim, most men aren't reading either.
Okay. And so now back to your expertise. I do want to hear more about your experience of researching and writing this book and kind of what drove you and some of your findings and surprises and intentions and next steps.
Yeah. It was really an amazing process to read these sources so closely. I think that what was both fun and challenging was just how huge these issues actually were. And when I was first hired by JOFA, they told me like, well, we already have 1 or 2 pages on this, so you'll just need to like write another couple of pages and then we'll be done. And if you buy the book, you'll see that it's not the case. It is not a 5-page article because it really touches on some of these very sweeping issues. First of all, about what we do when we actually delve into a source and one source is rereading or misreading or misquoting an earlier source, and what you do with that. It led me to questions about sort of derech hapsak, about how law is made. So, for example, this idea that the Bahag kind of rescues the Tosefta, but like without that, would anyone have cared about the Tosefta? Like, not so clear. And what was the Bahag doing? That took me into a lot of interesting conversations. and just in general, sorting out kind of like public policy from halacha per se was really interesting. And then, like I said, some of this was really larger questions. Like the question of tzibur is something that I personally would like to return to in terms of writing and research, because it's vast and so important. I think that, Megillah reading, like I said, has been a part of my spiritual life for a long time, and I would feel very excluded from the community if I couldn't participate in a women's Megillah reading. That's like me and my personal kind of spirituality. But when you get to the question of tzibur, if you say that women aren't part of the tzibur, like that's a really, really fundamental statement. I think that many of us in the Orthodox community are really used to the idea that women don't count in a minyan. It might bother us, but we could sort of say that and it kind of rolls off the tongue, maybe some of the time at least. But women not being part of the tzibur, or like that conversation, feels very, very important to me. So that's for me kind of like a next step. And then just knowing that there are so many more resources out there, and some of these sources that I quote are really very recent. So I think it's exciting that this is something that's still developing. That a girl who's born today is just so much more likely to be a part of a women's Megillah reading than I was when I was young, and so watching how that develops is an important next step for me.
I was going to say, in some communities, my kids are, not born today. They are 11 and 14. And in their experience, they have many times only had women's Megillah reading. So yes, 100% is just a different generation than when I was growing up and versus now. I want to thank you so much. This has been a fascinating conversation to be a part of. I want to wish you a Chag Purim Sameach and a Chodesh Tov. And I look forward to, to what comes next.
All right. Chag Purim Sameach, everyone. Chodesh Tov. Thank you so much for participating.
Thank you.
Bye.